that are if you had a message towards the Muslims who are now getting involved in social organizing or political organizing or liberation struggles?
Well, yes, of course. I think it's very important that Muslims, especially young Muslims, understand the history of Islam in the United States, and how that history is deeply connected to racial oppression, and I think that many young Muslims do not fully realize that prior to 9/11, that Islam was the fastest growing religion in the United States, and that the majority of Muslims in the United States were, as the U.S. government defines them, as indigenous Muslims or African Americans. That Islam in the United States history began with the slave trade, and that we were treated as anathema in the United States long before 9/11. That meant some of the political prisoners in jail today, prior to those who were wrongly convicted under these conspiracy and post 9/11 terrorist charges, were the majority of them were African American Muslims. Imam Jamil Al-Amin, who was once Rap Brown, a prominent figure in the Black Power and Civil Rights movement, is a political prisoner. So it's very important for Muslims to understand this, and this is very key too, because Islamophobia in the United States roots are in white supremacy, are in racism, are in the complicity of Christianity and Christian values in America, in complicity with racist terrorism in the United States. One of the symbols of the foremost racist terrorist group, the Ku Klux Klan, is a burning cross. So we need to understand the confluence of racist white Christian dogma in rationalizing and justifying the slave trade, and how it has impacted Islamophobia in the United States. And I don't think that especially immigrant Muslims who come from families who have migrated and immigrated to the United States, fully appreciate the nexus between white supremacy and Islamophobia. And as a consequence, many of the Muslim organizations that are dominated by immigrant Muslim communities seldom show solidarity with the fight for human rights by black people in the U.S., the fights for civil rights that we have experienced. And by not drawing on this experience against white supremacy and racism and Islamophobia, the immigrant community has been put into a very vulnerable position. Many young immigrant Muslims have been framed and imprisoned on flimsy terrorist charges, and the mechanisms and the grand juries that they use to do this are the same mechanisms and grand juries that they use to imprison black activists and anti-racist activists in this country. So I think that those young Muslims who are now becoming active in the struggle have to increase their understanding of the role of Islam in American society, how it has its roots in white supremacy, the resistance to white supremacy, and exhibit concrete solidarity with people of color in this country in fighting for their human rights, and in fighting for against Islamophobia and Zionism in this country.
Do you have any suggestions in concrete things people can do to start moving on that? What can Muslims do?
Yes, I think the issue of political prisoners is one. We know now there are dozens of young Muslim activists, young Muslims, who have been framed and imprisoned, and there are scores of black and Puerto Rican and Mexican American political prisoners. So the issue of political prisoners and the rights of political prisoners and the injustice of the criminal justice system is a flashpoint in the issue that Muslim activists can get immediately involved in. I think that the same thing applies to the African community. Don't get me wrong here. There's a lot of misunderstanding of Islam in the African American community among black people because they have not been adequately prepared and engaged by African American Muslims over the last several decades. So this isn't something that's solely a result of the ignorance or uninformed immigrant Muslim community. This is something that has been going on for decades in the black community as well. And this confusion, of course, has its roots in some of the messianic movements that came out of the Garvey era, the Nation of Islam and other organizations that completely confuse black people about what the real nature of Islam and the Ummah is and what it stands for. There was a mass movement in this country called the Dar es Salaam movement that existed on the East Coast right after the repression of the Black Panther Party and civil rights movement in the early 1970s. And this Dar es Salaam movement was massive. It had thousands and thousands of converts who were predominantly African American. But it was destroyed by a combination of the messianic movements in the black community and immigrant Muslims who attacked this upsurge of black recruitment into Islam and divided it. This is a very important history, and there are individuals and groups who understand this history. One such individual who is playing a pivotal role in this is Imam Talib, Abdul Rashid. And Imam Talib came out of the Dar es Salaam movement. He worked with political prisoners for years. He worked in the correctional system and interacted with Muslim political prisoners long before 9/11. And you have a lot of imams who are black imams, African American imams who are activists in the civil rights and black liberation struggles. And so I think that these are the best conduits for the type of alliances and solidarity that we need now to deal with this particular feature of white supremacy, Islamophobia. And we have to understand, too, that this is also a reflection, Islamophobia is also a reflection of U.S. foreign policy. And U.S. foreign policies in the lands that many of the immigrant Muslims come from. And whether it's Pakistan, whether it's the Sudan, whether it's North Africa, the Middle East, we have to really understand that there is an enormous amount of opportunity here for us to forge anti-imperialist alliance with civil society, with secular progressive movements, and that it's very important that Muslims in America begin to forge these types of alliances.
I guess the last thing I wanted to ask you on this topic is how did you become Muslim? I believe that you weren't born Muslim, correct?
Well, we all are born Muslim.
Yeah, alhamdulillah. Yes, we are. Well, and also I wanted to, beyond that question, is how has that influenced your engagement in struggle?
Well, I returned to Islam. I became Muslim while I was a political prisoner, and for me, the return to Islam and to the Deen was essentially, I think, a confluence of spiritual maturity, spiritual need for spiritual validation of much of the secular struggle that I was involved in. One of the characteristics of the movement in the 60s, especially organizations like the Black Panther Party and the BLA, was a de-emphasis in spirituality.
The de-emphasis?
A de-emphasis,
okay.
Yeah. And, I was one of those individuals that actually read Das Kapital. and different Marxist and Leninist tomes, and took an immediate had an immediate affinity with dialectical materialism and dialectical historical materialism as a method of analysis. But I also just never satisfied or related to any type of spirituality on my part. My family was raised as Episcopalians. They were West Indian and from the South. So that was my orientation in terms of spirituality. But having grown up in the United States, in the black community, Islam was always a presence somewhere in our community. There was always Muslims in our community that we saw every day. And so when I turned in my 40s, when I became, it was coincidental. It was about the same time that the Prophet received Wahi or divine revelation,
yes,
when he was 41. It marked a period in my personal and political development where Islam fulfilled and answered a lot of things for me. Islam encouraged me to struggle for what was true, what was right, to stand up against oppressors, which is something I've done all my life, to consider the weak and the poor who were unable to resist and who were unable to fight oppression. Islam gave me that spiritual backbone to realize that my struggle, the struggle that I've engaged in, was not just about empowering black people. It was about empowering humanity. It was about dealing with the existential and condition of humanity. And so I saw my struggle as in those terms. My struggle was broadened in those terms. Even though I was a Pan-African, even though I was anti-imperialist, even though I had worked on the Palestinian Solidarity Committees with Muslims, when I was in the Panther Party, Islam came to me as a verification and a vindication of my secular struggle in a certain way. So that's basically how I can say I came to Islam.
Alhamdulillah. That's thank you for that. Thank you for sharing that.